Hey guys, welcome back. I hope you guys enjoyed the last one. Like I said, this is going to be a consecutive timeline of one event after the other. So it looks like this chapter coming up, we're going to be getting into the Revolutionary War and afterwards. And I'm really excited to get into that and to learn more. I myself have learned a lot from these readings that I didn't know. And I'm hoping you guys are all enjoying it and have learned a lot yourself. And again, like always, I will continue to put the purchasing link and the bio of the author in the description below for newcomers who don't know about Howard Zinn or maybe are curious about the book. And to show you guys again, this is the People's History of the United States by Howard Zinn. I don't know if you guys... I like the cover personally. I think it's well done. Other than that, I think we should go ahead and jump into Chapter 5. A kind of revolution. The American victory over the British Army was made possible by the existence of an already armed people. Just about every white male had a gun and could shoot. The revolutionary leadership distrusted the mobs of poor, but they knew the revolution had no appeal to slaves and Indians. They would have to woo the armed white population. And that'll change later on. This was not easy. Yes, mechanics and sailors, some others, were incensed against the British, but the general enthusiasm for the war was not strong. While much of the white population went into military service at one time or another during the war, only a small fraction stayed. John Shea, in his study of the Revolutionary Army, a people numerous and armed, says they, quote, grew weary of being bullied by local committees, of safety by corrupt deputy assistant commissaries, of supply and by bands of ragged strangers, with guns in their hands, calling themselves soldiers of the Revolution. End quote. Shea estimates that perhaps a fifth of the population was actively treasonous. John Adams had estimated a third opposed, a third in support, a third neutral. Alexander Hamilton, an aide of George Washington, and an upcoming member of the new elite, wrote from his headquarters, quote, our countrymen have all the folly of the ass, and all the passiveness of the sheep. They are determined not to be free. If we are saved, France and Spain must save us. End quote. Slavery got in the way in the South Carolina, insecure since the slave uprising and Stono in 1739, could hardly fight against the British. Her militia had to be used to keep slaves under control. The men who first joined the colonial militia were generally, quote, hall markets of respectability, or at least of full citizenship, end quote. Their communities, Shea says, excluded from the militia were friendly Indians, free Negroes, white servants, and free white men who had no stable home. But desperation led to the recruiting of the less respectable whites, Massachusetts and Virginia, providing for drafting, quote, strollers, vagrants, and to the militia. In fact, the military became a place of promise for the poor, who might rise in rank, acquire some money, change their social status. Here was the traditional device by those in charge of my social order: mobilize and discipline a recalcitrant population, offering the adventure and rewards of military service to get poor people to fight for a cause they might not see as clearly as their own. A wounded American lieutenant at Bunker Hill, interviewed by Peter Oliver, a Tory who admittedly might have been looking for such a response, told he had joined the rebel forces. I was a shoemaker and got my living by my labor. When this rebellion came on, I saw some of my neighbors got into commission, who were no better than myself. I was very ambitious, and did not like to see those above me. I was asked to enlist as a private soldier. I offered to enlist upon having a lieutenant's commission, which was granted. I imagine myself now in the way of promotion. If I was killed in battle, there'd be no end to me. But if my captain was killed, I shall rise in rank, and shall all have a chance to rise higher. These, sir, were the only motives of my entering into the service, for as to the dispute between Great Britain and the colonies, I know nothing of it. And that is something that you will see very common. And studying the Revolutionary history was you had people on both sides who enlisted just so they can get themselves out of poverty, while others did not want to enlist because they didn't agree with it. Now some did join, not agreeing with the cause, because they just want to fight for their country. So it's something very interesting that we'll see later on in the book. So John Shea investigated the subsequent experience of the Bunker Hill Lieutenant. He was William Scott of Petersboro, New Hampshire, and after years prisoner of the British he escaped, made his way back to the American Army, fought in battles in New York, was captured again by the British, and escaped again by swimming the Hudson River, one night with his sword tied around his neck and his watch pinned to his head. He returned to New Hampshire, recruited a company of his own, including the 2 eldest sons, and fought in various battles until his health gave way. He watched his eldest son die of camp fever. After 6 years of service, he had sold his farm in Peterborough for a note that, quote, that with inflation became worthless. After the war, he came to public attention when he rescued 8 people from drowning after their boat had turned over in New York Harbor. He then got a job surveying western lands with the army, but caught a fever and died in 1796. Scott was one of many revolutionary fighters, usually of lower and military ranks. From poor and obscure backgrounds, Shea's study of the Peterborough contingent shows that the prominent and substantial citizens of the town had served only briefly in the war. Other American towns show the same pattern. As Shea puts it, quote, Revolutionary America may have been a middle-class society, happy and more prosperous than any other time, but it contained a large and growing number of fairly poor people, and many of them did much of the actual fighting and suffering between 1775 and 83. A very old story, end quote. The military conflict itself, by dominating everything in its time, diminished other issues, made people choose sides in the contest that was publicly important, forced people onto the side of the revolution, whose interest in independence was not all obvious. Ruling elites seem to have learned through generations, consciously or not, that war makes them more secure against internal trouble. The force of military preparation had a way of pushing neutral people into line. In Connecticut, for instance, a law was passed requiring military service of males between 16 and 60, omitting certain government officials, ministers, Yale students and faculty, Negroes, Indians, and mulattoes, which remember, mulatto is Mexican. Someone called to duty could provide a substitute or to get up by paying £5, grabbing your way out of the military. When 18 men failed to show up for military duty, they were jailed, and in order to be released, had to pledge to fight in the war. Shea says, quote, the mechanism of their political conversion was the militia, end quote. What looks like the democratization of the military force in modern times shows up as something different, a way of forcing large numbers of reluctant people to satiate themselves with the national cause, and by the end of the process, believe in it. Here in the War for Liberty was conscription. Conscription is a form of enlistment. It's basically a draft. As usual, cognizant of wealth, with the impressment riots against the British still remembered, impressment of seamen by the American Navy was taking place by 1779. A Pennsylvania official called it, quote, we cannot help observing how similar this conduct is to that of the British officers during our subjection to Great Britain, and are persuaded by it, will have the same unhappy effects, viz. An estrangement of the affections of the people from our authority, which by an easy progression will proceed to open opposition and bloodshed, end quote. Watching the new, tight discipline of Washington's army, a chaplain in Concord. Chaplain is a preacher of the church. They're the ones who go and preach the Bible while they're on the trail or before they enter battle. So the chaplain in Concord, Massachusetts wrote, quote, new lords, new laws. The strictest government is taking place, and great distinction is made between officers and men, everyone is made to know his place, and to keep it or be immediately tied up, and receive not 1, but 30 or 40 lashes." End quote. The Americans lost the first battles of the war. Bunker Hill, Brooklyn Heights, Harlem Heights, the Deep South. They won small battles at Trenton and Princeton. And then, at a turning point, a big battle. Saratoga, New York in 1777. Washington's frozen army hung at Valley Forge, Pennsylvania. Valley Forge was like the breaking point for Washington's army. They were either going to succeed, and Washington was able to, boost the morale and round up the troops and go at it, or they were going to flee and call it quits. Well, Benjamin Franklin negotiated an alliance with the French monarchy, which was anxious for revenge on England. Now remember, like I said, Benjamin Franklin he loved spending time with women, and that's why he became minister to France. Why? Because he had sexual relations with a lot of French women. Just put that out there. The war turned to the south, where the British won victory after victory, until the Americans, aided by a large French army. Ben Franklin's the reason why French joined us, and they wanted it afterwards because of the American Revolution. With the French Navy blocking off the British from supplies and reinforcements. Blocking off means blockade. Won the final victory of the war at Yorktown, Virginia in 1781. Through all of this, the suppressed conflicts between rich and poor among the Americans kept reappearing in the midst of the war in Philadelphia, which Eric Foner describes as, quote, "a time of immense profits for some colonists and terrible hardships for others," end quote. The inflation, prices rose in 1 month that year by 45%, led to agitation and calls for action. One Philadelphia newspaper carried a reminder in Europe, quote, "The people have always done themselves justice when the scarcity of bread has arisen from the avarice of $4. They have broken open magazines, appropriated stores for their own use without paying for them, and in some instances have hung up the culprits who created their distress," end quote. In May of 1779, the First Company of Philadelphia Artillery petitioned the Assembly about the troubles of, quote, "the middling and poor," end quote, and threatened violence against, quote, "those who are avariciously intent upon amassing wealth by the destruction of the more virtuous part of the community," end quote. The same month, there was a mass meeting, an extra-legal gathering, which called for print reductions and initiated an investigation of Robert Morse, a rich Philadelphian who was accused of holding food from the market. In October came the, quote, "Fort Lunsden riot," end quote, in which a militia group marched into the city into the house of James Wilson. A militia group marched into the city house of James Wilson, a wealthy lawyer and revolutionary official who had opposed price controls and the Democratic Constitution, attacked in Pennsylvania in 1776. The militia were driven away by a, quote, "silk-stocking brigade," a well-off Philadelphia citizens. It seemed to the majority of white colonists, who had a bit of land or no property at all, were still better off than the slaves or indentured servants or Indians, and could be wooed into the coalition of the Revolution. But when the sacrifices of war became more bitter, the privileges and safety of the rich became harder to accept. About 10% of the white population, an estimate of Jackson, Maine, and the social structure of Revolution America. Book title: Large landlords and merchants held £1,000 or more in parcel property and £1,000 in land, at least, and these men owned nearly half the wealth of the country and held as slaves 1/7 of the country's people. The Continental Congress, which governed the colonies through the war, was dominated by rich men, linked together in factions and compacts by businesses and family connections. These links connected North and South, East and West. For instance, Richard Henry Lee of Virginia was connected with the Adams of Massachusetts and the Shippens of Pennsylvania. Delegates from middle and southern colonies were connected with Robert Morse of Pennsylvania. Through commerce and land speculation, Morse was superintendent of finance, and his assistant was Governor Morse. Morse's plan was to give more assurance to those who had loaned money to the Continental Congress, and gain the support of the officers by voting half pay for life for those who stuck to the end. This ignored the common soldier who was not getting paid, who was suffering in the cold, dying of sickness, watching the civilian profiteers get rich. On New Year's Day, 1789, the Pennsylvania troops near Morristown, New Jersey, perhaps emboldened by rum, dispersed their officers, killed one captain, wounded others, and were marching, fully armed with cannon, toward the Continental Congress at Philadelphia. George Washington handled it cautiously. Informed of these developments by General Anthony Wayne, he told Wayne not to use force. He was worried that the rebellion might spread to his own troops. He suggested Wayne get a list of the soldiers' grievances and said Congress should not flee Philadelphia because that the way would then be open for the soldiers to be joined by Philadelphia citizens. He sent Knox rushing to England on his horse to get 3 months' pay for the soldiers while he prepared 1,000 men to march on the mutineers as a least resort. A peace was negotiated in which one half the men were discharged, the other half got furloughs. Now, when they say mutineers, mutiny is when your own troops rise up and say, we're done, give us what we want, or we're going to take over. And that usually means the captain or the chief or colonel is going to die. Shortly after this, a smaller mutiny took place in the New Jersey line, involving 200 men who defied their officers and started out for the state capital of Trenton. Now Washington was ready. 600 men, who themselves had been well fed and clothed, marched on the mutineers and surrounded and disarmed them. The 3 ringleaders were put on trial immediately. In the field, 1 was pardoned and 2 were shot by firing squad. Made up their friends, who wept as they pulled the trigger. It was a, quote, an example, Washington said. 2 years later, there was another mutiny in the Pennsylvania line. The war was over and the army had disbanded. But 80 soldiers, demanding their pay, invaded the Continental Congress headquarters in Philadelphia and forced their members to flee across the river to Princeton. Quote, ignominiously turned out of doors, end quote. As one historian sorrowfully wrote, John Fix, The Critical Period, quote, by a handful of drunken mutineers, end quote. What soldiers in the Revolution could do only rarely, rebel against their authorities, civilians could do more, much more easily. Ronald Hoffman says, quote, the Revolution plunged the states of Delaware, Maryland, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, and to a much lesser degree Virginia, into divisive conflicts that persisted during the entire struggle period, end quote. The southern lower classes resisted being mobilized for the Revolution. They saw themselves under the rule of a political elite, win or lose against the British. In Maryland, for instance, by the new Constitution of 1776, to run for governor one had to own 5,000 pounds of property. To run for state senator, 1,000 pounds. Thus, 90% of the population were excluded from holding office. And so, as Hoffman says, quote, small slave excluded from holding office, small slave holders, non-slave planters, tenants, renters, and casual day laborers posed a serious problem of social control for the Whig elite, end quote. While black slaves 25% of the population, and in some counties 50%. Fear of slave revolts grew. George Washington had turned down the request of blacks seeking freedom to fight in the Revolutionary Army. That'll change. So when the British Army commander in Virginia, Lord Dunmore, promised freedom to Virginia slaves who joined his forces, this created consternation. A report from Maryland County worried about poor whites encouraging slave runaways. The insolescence of the Negro in the county is come to such a height that we are under a necessity of disarming them, which we effected on Saturday last. It means last Saturday. We took about 80 guns, some bayonets, swords, etc. The malicious and imprudent speeches of some among the lower classes of whites had introduced them to believe that their freedom depended on the successes of their king's troops. We cannot therefore be too vigilant, too rigorous with those who promote and encourage this disposition in our slaves. Even more unsettling was white rioting in Maryland. against leading families supporting the revolution who were suspected of hoarding needed commodities. The class hatred of some of these disloyal people was expressed by one man who said, quote, "It was better for the people to lay down their arms and pay the duties and taxes laid upon them by king and parliament than to be brought into slavery and to be commanded and ordered about as they were." End quote. A wealthy Maryland landowner, Charles Carroll, took note of the surly mood all around him. There is a mean, low, dirty envy which creeps through all ranks and cannot suffer a man a superiority of fortune, of merit, or of understanding in fellow citizens. Either these are sure to entail a general ill will and dislike upon the owners. Despite this, Maryland authorities retained control. They made concessions, taxing land and slaves more heavily, letting debtors pay in paper money. It was a sacrifice by the upper class to maintain power, and it worked. In the lower South, however, in the Carolinas and Georgia, according to Hoffman, quote, "False regions were left without the slightest apparition of authority." End quote. The general mood was to take no part in the war that seemed to have nothing for them. End quote. Authoritative personages on both sides demanded that common people supply material, reduce consumption, leave their families, and even risk their lives. Forced to make hard decisions, many flailed out in frustration, or evaded and defied, first one side, then the other. End quote. Washington's military commander in the lower South, Nathaniel Greene, dealt with disloyalty by policy of concessions to some, brutality to others. In a letter to Thomas Jefferson, he described a raid by his troops on loyalists, quote, "They made a dreadful carnage of them, upwards of 100 were killed and most of the rest cut to pieces. It has had a very happy effect on those respected persons, of which there were still many in this country." End quote. Greene told of his generals, quote, "To strike terror into our enemies and to give spirit to our friends." End quote. On the other hand, he advised the governor of Georgia, quote, "To open the door for the disaffected of your state to come in." End quote. In general, through the states, concessions were kept to a minimum. The new constitutions were drawn up in all states from 1776 to 1780. Were not much different from the old ones, although property qualifications for voting and holding office were lowered in some instances. In Massachusetts they were increased, while only Pennsylvania abolished them totally. The new Bills of Rights had modifying provisions. North Carolina, providing for religious freedom, added, quote, "That nothing herein contained shall be construed to exempt preachers of treasonable or seditious discourse from legal trial and punishment." End quote. Maryland, New York, Georgia, and Massachusetts took similar cautious. The American Revolution, sometimes said to have brought about the separation of church and state. The northern states made such declarations, but after 1776, they adopted taxes that forced everyone to support Christian teachings. William G. McLaughlin quoted Supreme Court Justice David Brewer in 1892 that, quote, "This is a Christian nation," quote, says of the separation of church and state in the Revolution that it, quote, "was neither conceived nor carried out. Far from being left to itself, religion was embedded into every aspect and institution of American life." End quote. One would look and examine the Revolution's effect on class relations, and what happened to land confiscated from fleeing loyalists. It was distributed in such a way as to give a double appropriate opportunity to the revolutionary leaders to enrich themselves and their friends, and to parcel out some land to small farmers to create a broad base of support for the new government. Indeed, this became characteristic of the new nation. Finding itself possessed of enormous wealth, it would create the richest ruling in class history. It's still having enough for the middle class to act as a buffer between the rich and the dispossessed, which means poor. The huge landholdings of the Loyalists had been one of the greatest incentives to the Revolution. Lord Fairfax in Virginia had been more than 5 million acres, encompassing 21 counties. Lord Baltimore's income from his Maryland holdings exceeded £30,000 a year. After the Revolution, Lord Fairfax was protected. He was a friend of George Washington, but other Loyalist holders of great estates, especially those who were absentees. Small farmers increased after the Revolution, and there were fewer tenant farmers who had created such trouble in the pre-Revolutionary years. But those who were absentees had the land confiscated in New York. Although the numbers of independent farmers grew, according to Rowland Berthoff and John Muir, quote, The class struggle did not change radically, end quote. The ruling group went through personal changes, as quote, the rising merchant families of Boston, New York, or Philadelphia, slipping quite credibly into the social status, and sometimes the very houses of those who failed in business or suffered confiscation and exile for loyalty to the crown, end quote. Edwin Morgan sums up the class nature of the revolution this way, quote, the fact that the lower ranks were involved in the contest should not obscure the fact that the contest itself was generally a struggle in office and power between members of the upper class, the new against the establishment, end quote. Looking at the situation after the revolution, Richard Morris comments, quote, everywhere one finds inequality, end quote. He finds the, quote, the people, quote, of, quote, we the people of the United States, a phrase coined by the very rich Governor Morris, did not mean Indians or blacks, or women or white servants. In fact, they are more indentured servants that over the revolution, quote, did nothing to end up and little to ameliorate the white bondage, end quote. Carr Degler says, out of our past, quote, no new social class came to power through the door of the American Revolution. The men who engineered the revolt were largely members of the colonial ruling class, end quote. George Washington was the richest man in America, John Hancock was a prosperous Boston merchant, Ben Franklin was a wealthy printer, and so on. On the other hand, town mechanics, laborers and seamen, as well as small farmers, were swept into, quote, the people, by the rhetoric of the revolution, by the camaraderie of military service, by the distribution of some land. Thus was created a substantial body of support and national consensus, something that even with the exclusion of ignored and oppressed people could be called, quote, America, end quote. Stoughton Lynn's close study of Dutchess County, New York in the Revolutionary period corroborates this. There were tenants rising in 1766 against the huge feudal estates in New York. The Rensselaerswyck holding it was 1,000,000 acres, tenants claiming some of this land for themselves, unable to get satisfaction in the courts, turned to violence. At Poughkeepsie, 1,700 armed tenants had closed the courts and broken up in the jails, but the uprising was crushed. During the Revolution, there was a struggle in Dutchess County over the disposition of confiscated lawyers' lands, but it was mainly between different elite groups. Elite cited. One of these, the Poughkeepsie Anti-Federalist opponents of the Constitution. Now remember, Anti-Federalists were against the Constitution, and Federalists were pro-Constitution. Including men on the make, newcomers, and landed business. They made promises to the tenants to gain their support, exploiting their grievances to build their own political careers and maintain their own fortunes. During the Revolution, to mobilize soldiers, the tenants were promised land. A prominent landowner of Dutchess County wrote in 1777 that it promised to make tenants freeholders, quote, would instantly bring you at least 6,000 arable farmers into the field, end quote. But the farmers who enlisted the Revolution and expected to get something out of it found that, as privates in the army, they received $6.66 a month, while a colonel received $75 a month. Big discrepancy. They watched local government contractors like Melanchthon Smith and Matthew Patterson become rich, while the pay they received in continental currency became worthless with inflation. Gotta remember, and this is present day, whenever there's a war or some major conflict, who makes money? Government contractors. All this led tenants to become a threatening force in the midst of the war. Many stopped paying rent. The legislature worked to pass a bill to confiscate loyalist land and add 400 new freeholders to the 1,800 already in the county. This meant a strong new voting bloc for the faction of the rich that had become anti-federalist in 1788. Once, new landlords were brought into the privileged circle of the Revolution and seemed politically under control. Their leaders, Melanchthon Smith and others, at first opposed the adoption of the Constitution, switched to support with the New York ratifying. Adoption was ensured. The new freeholders found that they had stopped being tenants, but were now mortgagors, paying back loans from banks and instead of rent to landlords. It seems that the rebellion against British rule allowed a certain group of the colonial elite to replace those loyal to England, give some benefits to small landholders, and leave poor white working people and tenant farmers in very much their old situation. What did the Revolution mean to the Native Americans, the Indians? They had been ignored by the fine words of the Declaration, had not been considered equal. Certainly not in choosing those who would govern the American territories in which they lived, nor in being able to pursue happiness as they had pursued it for centuries before the white Europeans arrived. Now, with the British out of the way, the Americans could begin the inexorable process of pushing the Indians off their lands, killing them if they resisted. In short, as Francis Jennings puts it, the white Americans were fighting against British imperial control in the East and for their own imperialism in the West. Before the Revolution, the Indians had been subdued by force in Virginia and in New England. Elsewhere, they had worked out of molds, a coexistence with the colonies, but around 1750, with the colonial population growing fast, to pursue pressure to move westward onto new land for the stage for conflict with the Indians. Land agents from the east began appearing in the Ohio River Valley, the territory of a confederation of tribes called the Covenant Chain, for which the Iroquois were spokesmen. At New York, their intricate swindling 800,000 acres of Mohawk land were taken, and in the period of Mohawk, New York, friendship, Chief Hendrick of the Mohawks is recorded speaking his bitterness to Governor George Clinton on the Provisional Council of New York in 1753. "Brother, when we came here to relate our grievances about our lands, we expected to have something else done for us. And we have told you that the covenant chain of our forefathers was like to be broken. And rather you tell us that we shall redress at Albany, but we know them so well, we will not trust to them, for they, the Albany merchants, are people, but devils so. As soon as we come home, we will send up a belt of wampum to our brothers, the 5 nations, to acquaint them with the covenant chain, and broken between you and us. So, brother, you are not to act here to have of in more, and brother, we desire to hear no more of you." When the British fought the French in North America in the 7 Years' War, the Indians fought on the side of the French. The French were traders but not occupiers of Indian lands. While the British clearly coveted their hunting grounds and living space, some reported the conversations of Shingas, chief of the Delaware Indians, with the British General Braddock, who sought his help against the French. Shingas asked General Braddock whether the Indians that were friends to the English might not be permitted to live and trade on the federal English, and having hunting ground sufficient to support themselves and families, on which General Braddock said that no savage should inherit the land, on which Shingas and the other chiefs answered that if they might have liberty to live on the land, they would not fight for it. When the war ended in 1763, the French, ignoring our old allies, ceded to the British lands west of the Appalachians. The Indians, therefore, united to make war on the British-French fronts. This is called, quote, Pontiac's conspiracy, end quote, by the British, but a liberation for the independence, end quote, in the words used by Francis Jennings, under orders from British General Jeffrey Amherst, the commander of Fort Pitts, gave the attacking Indian chiefs, with whom he was negotiated blankets from the smallpox hospital. It was a pioneering effort at which is now called biological warfare. An epidemic soon spread among the Indians. Despite this, and the burning of villages, the British could not destroy the will of the Indians, who continued guerrilla war, which means like hiding in the trees and running around, staying hidden. You're not marching a straight line or staying in one position. This was a royal proclamation of 1763, and it angered Americans. The original Virginia Charter said its land went westward to the ocean. It helps to explain why most of the Indian land fought for England. During the Revolution, with their French allies, then their England allies gone, the Indians faced a new land-covering nation alone. The Americans assumed now that the Indians' land was theirs, but the expeditions they sent westward to establish this were overcome, which they recognized in the names they gave these battles: Harmer's humiliation and St. Clair's shame. And even when General Anthony Wayne defeated the Indians, Western Confederation in 1798 at the Battle of Fallen Timbers, he had to recognize their power. In the Treaty of Grenville, it was agreed in that in return for return to secessions of land in the United States would give claims to the Indian lands north of the Ohio, which is where I'm from, by the way, east of the New Mississippi, and south of the Great Lakes, but if the Indians decided to sell these lands, they would offer them first to the United States. Jennings, putting the Indian into the center of the American Revolution. After all, it was Indian land that everyone was fighting over. Sees the Revolution as a, quote, multiplicity of variously oppressed and exploited peoples who preyed upon each other, unquote. With the Eastern elite controlling the lands on the seaboard, the poor seeking land were forced to go west, there becoming a useful bulwark for the rich because, as Jennings says, quote, the first target the Indian hatchet was the frontiersman's skull, unquote. The situation of black slaves as a result of the American Revolution was more complex. Thousands of blacks fought with the British. 5,000 were with the revolutionaries, most of them from the North, but there were also free blacks from Virginia and Maryland. The lower South was reluctant to arm blacks. Amid the urgency of chaos of war, thousands sought their freedom, living on British ships at the end of the war to settle in England, Nova Scotia, the West Indies, or Africa. Many others stayed in America as free blacks, evading their masters. In the northern states, the combination of blacks in the military, the lack of powerful economic need for slaves, and the rhetoric of revolution led to the end of slavery, but very slowly. As late as 1810, 30,000 blacks, one-fourth of the American black population of the North remained slaves. In 1840, there were still 1,000 slaves in the North. In the Upper South, there were more free Negroes than before, leading to more controlled legislation. In the Lower South, slavery expanded with the growth of rice and cotton plantations. What the Revolution did was to create space and opportunity for blacks to begin making demands of white society. Sometimes these demands came from the new and small black elites in Baltimore, Philadelphia, Richmond, Savannah, sometimes from articulate and bold slaves, pointing to the Declaration of Independence. Blacks petitioned Congress and the state legislatures to abolish slavery, to give blacks equal rights, and Boston blacks asked for city money, which whites were getting to educate their children. In Norfolk, they asked to be allowed to testify in court. Nashville blacks asserted that their, quote, free Negroes ought to have the same opportunities to go than any person, end quote. Peter Matthews, a free Negro butcher in Charleston, joined other free black artisans and tradesmen in petitioning the legislature to repeal discriminatory laws against blacks. In 1780, 7 blacks in Dartmouth, Massachusetts, petitioned the legislature for the right to vote, linking taxation to representation. We've heard that before. We apprehended ourselves to be aggrieved, and that while we are not allowed the privilege of freemen of the state having no vote or influence in the election of those that tax us, yet many of our colour, as well as known, have cheerfully entered the field of battle in the defence of the common cause, and that, as we conceive, against a similar exertion of power in regard to taxation, too well known to need a recital in this place, is black man Benjamin Banneker, who taught himself mathematics and astronomy, predicted accurately a solar eclipse, and was appointed to plan to the new city of Washington, wrote to Thomas Jefferson. I suppose it is a truth too well attested to you, to need a proof here, that we are race of beings who have been long labored under the abuse and censure of the world, that we have long been looked upon with an eye of contempt, and that we have long been considered rather as brutish than human, and scarcely capable of mental endowments. I apprehend you will embrace every opportunity to eradicate that train of absurd and false ideals and opinions which so generally prevails with respect to us, and that your sentiments are concurrent with mine, which are that one universal Father hath given us to believe all, and that hath not only made to all of us one flesh, but he has also, without partiality, afforded all of us with the same sensations and endowed us with the same facilities. Banneker asked Jefferson to, quote, to win yourselves from those narrow prejudices which you have embedded, end quote. Jefferson tried to best, as an enlightened, thoughtful individual might, but the structure of American society, the power of the cotton plantation, the slave trade, the politics of unity between northern and southern cities, elites, and the long culture of race prejudice in the colonies, as well as his own experience, weakness. The combination of practical need and ideological fixation kept Jefferson a slave owner throughout his life. The inferior positions of blacks, the exclusion of Indians from the new society, the establishment of supremacy for the rich and powerful in the new nation, all this was already settled in the new colonies, and by the time of the Revolution, with English out of the way, it could now be put on paper, solidified, regularized, made legitimate, by the Constitution of the United States, drafted at the Convention of Revolutionary Leaders in Philadelphia. Too many Americans over the years, the Constitution drawn up in 1787 has seemed to a work of genius put together by wise, humane men who created a legal framework for democracy and equality. This view is stated a bit extravagantly by the historian George Bancroft, writing in the early 19th century. The Constitution establishes nothing that interferes with equality and individuality, and knows nothing of differences by descent or opinions of favored classes, or legalizes religion or the political power of property. It leaves the individual alongside of the individual. As the sea is made up of drops, American society is composed of separate, free, and constantly moving atoms, ever in reciprocal action, so that the institutions and laws of the country rise out of the mass of individuals, without which, like the waters of the ocean, are rolling evermore. Another view of the Constitution was put forward early in the 20th century by the historian Charles Beard, arousing anger and indignation, including a denunciation editorial in the New York Times. He wrote in his book, An Economic Interpretation of the Constitution, "Inasmuch as the primary object of a government, beyond the mere repression of physical violence, is making of the rules which determine who the property relations of members of society, the dominant classes whose rights are thus to be determined must, perforce, obtain from the government such rules as are consistent with the larger interest necessary for the continuance of their economic pressures, or they must themselves control the organs of government." In short, Beard said, the rich must, in their own interest, either control the government directly or control the laws by which government operates. Beard applied this general idea to the Constitution by studying the economic backgrounds and political ideas of the 55 men who gathered in Philadelphia in 1787 to draw up the Constitution. He found that the majority of them were lawyers by profession, that most of them were men of wealth in land, slaves, manufacturing, or shipping. The half of the men had money loaned out of interest, and that 40 of the 50 held government bonds, according to the records of the Treasury Department. Thus, Beard found that most of the makers of the Constitution had some direct economic interest in establishing a strong federal government. The manufacturers needed protective tariffs. The moneylenders wanted to stop the use of paper money to pay off debts. The land speculators wanted protection as they invaded Indian lands. Slave owners needed federal security against slave revolts and runaways. Bondholders wanted a government able to raise money by nationwide taxation to pay off those bonds. 4 groups, Beard noted, were not represented in the Constitutional Convention: slaves, indentured servants, women, men without property. And so the Constitution did not reflect the interests of those groups. He wanted to make it clear that he did not think the Constitution was written merely to benefit the Founding Fathers personally, although one could not ignore the $450,000 of fortune of Benjamin Franklin, the connections of Thomas Hamilton, the wealthy interest through the father-in-law and brother-in-law, the great slave plantation of James Madison, the enormous landholdings of George Washington. Rather, it was to benefit the groups the founders represented, the quote, economic interest, the understood and felt in concrete, definite form through their own personal experience, end quote. Not everyone at the Philadelphia Convention fitted Beard's scheme. Elbridge Gerry of Massachusetts was the holder of land property, and yet he opposed the ratification of the Constitution. Similarly, Luther Martin of Maryland, whose ancestors had obtained large tracts of land in New Jersey, opposed ratification, but with a few exceptions, Beard found a strong connection between wealth and support of the Constitution. By 1787, there was not only positive need for strong central government to protect the large economic interests, but also immediate fear of rebellion by discontented farmers. The chief event causing this fear was an uprising in the summer of 1786 in western Massachusetts known as Shays Rebellion. In the western towns of Massachusetts, there was a resentment against the legislature in Boston. The new Constitution of 1780 had raised the property qualifications for voting. No one could hold state office without being quite wealthy. Furthermore, the legislature was refusing to issue poor paper money, and has been done in some other states, like Rhode Island, to make it easier for debt-ridden farmers to pay off their creditors. Illegal conventions began to assemble in some of the western counties to organize opposition to the legislature. At one of those, A man named Plow Jogger spoke his mind. I have been greatly abused, have been obliged to do more than my part in the war. Been loaded with class rates, town rates, provinces rates, continental rates, and all rates. Been pulled and hauled by sheriffs, constables, and collectors, and had my cattle sold for less than what they were worth. The great men are going to get all we have. I think it's time for us to rise and put a stop to it. We have no more counts. No sheriffs, no collectors, no lawyers. The chairman of the meeting used his gavel to cut short the applause. He and others wanted to redress their grievances, but peacefully, by petition to the General Court, the legislature in Boston. However, before the scheduled meeting or the General Court, there were going to be court proceedings in New Hampshire County, and the towns of Northampton and Springfield, to seize the cattle of farmers who had paid their debts, to take away their land now full of grain and ready for harvest. And so veterans of the Continental Army also agreed, because they had been treated poorly on discharge, given certificates for future redemption instead of immediate cash, began to organize the farmers and disclosing companies. One of these veterans was Luke Day, who would arrive the morning of court with a five and drum corpse, still angry with the memory of being locked up in the debtor's prison in the heat of the previous summer. The sheriff looked to the local militia to defend the court against these armed farmers, but most of the militia was with Luke Day. The sheriff did manage to gather 500 men, and the judges put on their black silk robes, waiting for the sheriff to protect their trip to the courthouse. But there at the courthouse steps, Luke Day stood with a petition asserting the people's constitutional right to protest the unconstitutional acts of the General Court, asking the judges to adjourn until the court could act on behalf of the farmers. Standing with Luke Day were 1,500 armed farmers. The judges adjourned. Shortly after, courthouses in Worcester and Athol, farmers with guns prevented the courts from beginning to take away their property, and the militia were too sympathetic to the farmers, or too outnumbered, and act. And at Concord, a 50-year-old veteran of 2 wars, Jobs Jaddock, led a caravan of carts, wagons, horses, and oxen onto the town green, while a message was sent to the judges. The voice of the people of this county is such that the court shall not enter this courthouse until such time as the people shall have redress of their grievances to labor at the present. A county convention then suggested the judges adjourn, which they did. At Great Barrington, a militia 1,000 faced a square crowded with armed men and boys. But the militia was split in its opinion. When the Chief Justice suggested the militia divide in those in favor of the court's sitting to go on the right side of the road, and those against on the left. 200 men on the militia went to the right, 800 to the left, and the judges adjourned. Then the crowd went to the home of the Chief Justice, who agreed to sign a pledge that the court would not sit until the Massachusetts General Court met. The court went back to the square, broke open the county jail, and set the children free, and set free the debtors. The Chief Justice, a country doctor, said, quote, "I have never heard anybody point out a better way to have their grievances redressed than the people have taken," unquote. The governor and the political leaders of Massachusetts became ashamed, alarmed. Samuel Adams, once looked on as a radical leader in Boston, now insisted people act within the law. He said, quote, "British emissaries were stirring up the farmers. People in the town of Greenwich responded, 'You in Boston have the money, and we don't. And didn't you act illegally yourselves in the Revolution?' The insurgents were now being called regulators. Their emblem was a sprig of hemlock. The problem went beyond Massachusetts. In Rhode Island, the debtors had taken over the legislature and were issuing paper money. In New Hampshire, several hundred men, in September of 1786, surrounded the legislature in Exeter, asking that the taxes be returned, and paper money issued. They dispersed only when military action was threatened. Daniel Shays entered the scene in western Massachusetts, a poor farm, and when the Revolution broke out, he joined the Continental Army, fought at Lexington, Bunker Hill, and Saratoga, and was wounded in action in 1780. Not being paid, he resigned from the army, went home, and soon found himself in court for non-payment of debts. He also saw what was happening to others. A sick woman, unable to pay, had her bed taken from under her. What brought Shays fully and the situation was on September 19th, the Supreme Judicial Court of Massachusetts met in Worcester and indicted 11 leaders of the rebellion, including 3 of his friends, as, quote, disorderly, riotous, and seditious prisoners, unquote, who unlawfully and by force of arms prevented, quote, the execution of justice and the laws of the Commonwealth, unquote. The Supreme Judicial Court planned to meet again in Springfield. A week later, there was talk of Luke Stays being indicted. Shay's organization organized 700 armed farmers, most of them veterans of the war, and led them to Springfield. There they found a general with 900 soldiers and a cannon. Shays asked the general for permission to parade, which the generals granted. So Shays and his men moved through the square, drums banging and fifes blowing. As they marched, their ranks grew. Some of the militia joined, and reinforcements began coming in from the countryside. The judges postponed hearings for a day, then adjourned the court. Now the General Court, meeting in Boston, were told by Governor James Bowdoin to, quote, vindicate the insulted dignity of government, unquote. The recent rebels against England, secure in office, were calling for law and order. Samuel Adams helped draw up a riot act and a resolution suspending habeas corpus to allow the authorities to keep people in jail without trial. At the same time, the legislature moved to make some concessions to the angry farmers, saying certain old taxes could not be paid in goods instead of money. This didn't help. In Worcester, 160 insurgents appeared at the courthouse. The sheriff read the riot act. The insurgents said they would disperse only if the judges did. The sheriff shouted something else about hanging. Someone came up behind him and put a sprig of hemlock in his hat. The judges left. Confrontations between farmers and militia now multiplied. The winter snows began to interfere with the trips of farmers to the courthouse. When Shays began marching 1,000 men into Boston, a blizzard forced them back, and one of his men froze to death. An army came to the field, led by General Benjamin Lincoln, on money raised by Boston merchants. In an artillery duel, 3 rebels were killed. 1 soldier stepped in front of his own artillery piece and lost both arms. The winter grew worse. The rebels were outnumbered and on the run. Shays took refuge in Vermont, and his followers began to surrender. There were a few more deaths in battle, and the sporadic disorganization, desperate acts of violence against authority, the burning of the barns, the slaughter of a general's horses. 1 government soldier was killed in an eerie night-time collision of 2 sleighs. Captured rebels were put on trial in Northampton, and 6 were sentenced to death. A note was left at the door of the High Sheriff of Pittsfield. I understand that there's a number of my countrymen condemned to die because they fought for justice. I pray for a care that you assist not in execution of a horrid crime. For by all of this above, that he condemns, that he executes, shall share alike. Perhaps your death will speed, for your life or mine is short. When the woods are covered with leaves, I shall return and pay you a short visit. 33 more rebels were put on trial, and 6 more condemned to death. Arguments were took over whether the hanging should go forward. General Lincoln urged mercy and a commission of clemency, but Samuel Adams, quote, on monarchy, the crime of treason may admit of being pardoned or lightly punished, but the man who dares rebel against the laws of a republic ought to suffer death, unquote. Several hangings followed. Some of the condemned were pardoned. Shays of Vermont was pardoned in 1788 and returned to Massachusetts when he died poor and obscure in 1825. It was Thomas Jefferson, in France's ambassador at the time of Shays Rebellion, who spoke of such uprisings as healthy for society. In a letter to a friend he wrote, quote, I hold it out a little rebellion now, and then is a good thing. It is immediate and necessary for the sound health of the government. God forbid that we should ever be 20 years without such a rebellion. The tree of liberty must be refreshed from time to time with the blood of patriots and tyrants. It's natural manure, unquote. But Jefferson was far from the scene. The political economic elite of the country were not so tolerant. They worded that the example might spread. A veteran of Washington's Army, General Henry Knox, founded an organization of Army veterans, quote, the Order of the Cincinnati, end quote, presumably, as one historian put it, quote, for the purpose of cherishing the historic memories of the struggle in which they had taken part, end quote. But also it seemed to watch out for radicalism in the new country. Knox wrote to Washington late
1786 about Shays Rebellion, and doing so expressed the thoughts of many of the wealthy and powerful leaders of the country. The people who are the insurgents have never paid any, but very little taxes, but they see the weakness of government. They feel at once their own poverty compared with the opulent, and their own force, and they are determined to make use of the latter in order to remedy the former. Their creed is quote, that the property of the United States has been protected from the confiscations of Britain by the joint exertions of all, and therefore ought to be the common property of all, and that the attempts, oppositions to this creed is an enemy to equality and justice, and they ought to be shut off from the face of the earth. End quote. Alexander Hamilton, aide to Washington during the war, was one of the most forceful and astute leaders to the new aristocracy. He voiced his political philosophy. All communities divide themselves into the few and the many. The first are the rich and well-born, the others are the mass of the people. The voice of the people has been said to be the voice of God. However, generally this maxim has been quoted and believed. It is not true, in fact. The peoples are turbulent and changing. They seldom judge or determine right. Yet therefore, to the first class a distinct permanent share in the government. Can a democratic assembly, who annually revolve in the mass of the people, be supposed steadily to pursue the public good? Nothing but a permanent body can check the imprudence of democracy. At the Continental Convention, Hamilton suggested a president and senate chosen for life. The convention did not take his suggestions, but neither did it provide for popular elections, except in the case of the House of Representatives, where the qualifications were set by the state legislatures, which required property holding for voting in almost all the states, and excluded women, Indian slaves. The Constitution provided for senators to be elected by the state legislatures, for the president to be elected by electors chosen by the state legislatures, and for the Supreme Court to be appointed by the president. Now, as you'll see, in today's politics, and even 100 years after this, founding of the country took place, the process of elections changed. He might get into this, but, originally the president and the vice president were both chosen by the people. Now the president chooses their own VP, and we have to vote the whole ticket in. And beforehand, like you said, the state legislatures voted for the senators, the U.S. senators. Now we get to. Or even, like the state legislature, the whole process is a little bit different. Well, the president still appoints the Supreme Court justice to this day. That's probably the only thing that actually stayed the same. The problem of democracy in the post-revolutionary society was not, however, the constitutional limitations of voting. It lay deeper, beyond the Constitution and the division of society into rich and poor. First, some people had great wealth and great influence, and they had the land, the money, the newspapers, the church, the educational system. The system. How could voting, however broad, cut into such power? There was still another problem. Wasn't it the nature of representative government, even when the most broadly based, to be conservative, to prevent tumultuous changes? It came time to ratify the Constitution, to submit a vote, and state conventions, with approval of 9 of the 13 required to ratify it. In New York, where debate over ratification was intense, a series of newspaper articles appeared anonymously, and they tell us much about the nature of the Constitution. These articles favoring adoption of the Constitution were written by James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, and John Jay came to be known as the Federalist Papers. Opponents of the Constitution became known as Anti-Federalists. In Federalist Papers number 10, James Madison argued that representative government was needed to maintain peace in a society ridden by factional disputes. These disputes came from, quote, the various and unequal distribution of property, unquote, those who hold and those who are without property have ever formed distinct interests in society, end quote. The problem, he said, we now have to control the factional struggles that came from the inequalities in the wealth. Minority factions can be controlled, he said, by the principle that decisions would be voted by the majority. So the real problem, according to Madison, was a majority faction, and here the solution was offered by the Constitution, to have, quote, an extensive republic and quote, that is a large nation ranging over 13 states, for then, quote, it would be more difficult for all who feel it to discover their own strength and to act in unison with each other, to influence of factious leaders, make kindle a flame within the particular states, but it will be enabled to spread a general conflagration through the other states, end quote. Madison's argument can be seen as a sensible argument for having a government which can maintain peace and avoid continuous disorder. But is the aim of government simply to maintain order as a referee between two equally matched fighters? Or is it the government has some special interest in maintaining a certain kind of order, a certain distribution of power and wealth, a distribution in which government officials are not neutral referees, but participants? In that case, the disorder they might worry about is the disorder of popular rebellion against those monopolizing the society's wealth. This interpretation makes sense when one looks at the economic interests, the social backgrounds of the makers of the Constitution. A part of his argument for a larger republic to keep the peace, James Madison tells quite clearly in Federalist No. 10, whose peace he wants to keep, quote, I write your pipe of money for an abolition of debts, for an equal division of property, for any improper or wicked project. He will less apt to pervade the whole body of the Union than a particular member of it, end quote. When economic interest is seen behind the political clauses of the Constitution, then the document becomes not simply the work of wise men trying to establish a decent and orderly society, but the work of certain groups trying to maintain their privileges while giving us just enough rights and liberties to enough of the people to ensure popular support. In the new government, Madison would belong to one party, the Democratic Republicans, along with Jefferson and Monroe. Hamilton would belong to the rival party, the Federalists, along with Washington and Adams, but both agreed on one a slaveholder from Virginia, the other a merchant from New York. On the end of this new government they were establishing, they were anticipating the long fundamental agreement of the two political parties in the American system. Hamilton wrote elsewhere in the Federalist Papers that the new Union would be able, quote, to repress the domestic faction and insurrection, end quote. He referred directly to Shays Rebellion, quote, the tempestuous situation from which Massachusetts has scarcely emerged evidences that dangers of this kind are not merely speculative, end quote. It was not either Madison or Hamilton. The authorship of the individual papers is not always known. Who in Federalist Paper No. 63 argued the necessity of, quote, a well-structured Senate as, quote, sometimes necessary as a defense to the people against their own temporary errors and delusions, end quote. Because, quote, there are particular moments in public affairs when the people, stimulated by some irregular passion, or some illicit advantage, or misled by the artful misrepresentations of interested men, may call for measures which they themselves will afterwards by the most ready to lament and condemn, end quote. End quote. In these critical moments, how salutary will be the interference of some temperate and respectable body of citizens in order to check the misguided career and to suspend the blow meditated by the people against themselves, until reason, justice, and truth can regain their authority over the public mind. The Constitution was a compromise between slaveholding interest of the South and moneyed interests of the North, for the purpose of uniting the 13 states and to regulating interstate commerce, and urged that such laws require only a majority of Congress to pass. The South agreed to this in return for allowing the trade in slaves to continue for 20 years before being outlawed. Charles Beard warned us that governments, including the government of the United States, are not neutral, that they represent the dominant economic interest, and that their constitutions are intended to serve these interests. One of his critics, Robert E. Brown, Charles Beard of the Constitution, raised an interesting point. Granted that the Constitution admitted the phrase, quote, life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, end quote, which appeared in the Declaration of Independence, and substituted, quote, life, liberty, and property. Well, why should the Constitution protect property? As Brown says about the Revolution in America, quote, practically everybody was interested in the protection of property because so many Americans owned property. However, this is misleading. True, there were many property owners, but some people had much more property than others. A few people had great amounts of property, many people had small amounts, others had none. Jackson, Maine found that 1/3 of the population in the Revolutionary period were small farmers, while only 3% of the population had truly large holdings and could be considered wealthy. Still, 1/3 was a considerable number of people who felt they had something at stake in the stability of a new government. This was a larger base of support for government than anyone in the world at the end of the 18th century. In addition, the city's mechanics had an important interest in government, which would protect their work from foreign competition. As Straughn Lynn puts it, quote, "How is it that the city workmen all over America overwhelmingly enthusiastically supported the United States Constitution?" This was especially true in New York. When the 9th and 10th states had ratified the Constitution, 4,000 New York City mechanics marched with flutes and banners to celebrate. Bakers, blacksmiths, brewers, ship joiners, and shipwrights, coopers, cartmen, and tailors all marched. What Lind found was that these mechanics, while opposing the elite rule in the colonies, were nationalists. Mechanics comprised perhaps half the New York population. Some were wealthy, some were poor, but all were better off than the ordinary laborer. They apprenticed the journeyman, and their prosperity required a government that would protect them against the British hats and shoes and other goods that were pouring into the colonies after the Revolution. As a result, the mechanics often supported wealthy conservatives at the ballot box. The Constitution then illustrates the complexity of the American system, that it serves the interests of a wealthy elite, but also does enough for small property owners, for middle-income mechanics and farmers to build a broad base of support. The slightly prosperous people who make up this base of support are buffers against the blacks, the Indians, the very poor whites. They enable the elite to keep control with a minimum of coercion, a maximum of law, all made palatable by the fanfare of patriotism and unity. The Constitution became even more acceptable to the public at large after the first Congress, responding to criticism, passed a series of amendments known as the Bill of Rights. No fun fact, earlier on in the book they talked about the Federalist Papers and the Anti-Federalist Papers. Well, actually, in one of those writings, I forget what it was, I read them all, but in one of them it talked about how the Bill of Rights shouldn't necessarily have been written because all these countries had something similar, but they called it the natural rights, as in these rights are natural, so I have a Bill of Rights, and then the rest of those rights being taken away. So that's a little fun fact for you. These amendments seem to make the new government a guardian of people's liberties to speak, to publish, to worship, to petition, to assemble, to be tried fairly, to be secure at home against official intrusion. It was, therefore, perfectly designed to build popular backing for the new government. What was not made clear, it was time when the language of freedom was new and its reality untested, was the shakiness of everyone's liberty when entrusted to a government of the rich and powerful. Indeed, the same problem existed for the other provisions of the Constitution, like the clause forbidding states to, quote, impair the obligation of contract, or giving Congress the power to tax the people. Appropriate money. They all sounded benign and neutral until one asked, quote, tax? Who? For what? Appropriate what? For who? To protect everyone's contracts like an act of fairness, of equal treatment, until one considers the contracts made between rich and poor, between employer and employee, landlord and tenant, creditor and debtor, generally favor the more powerful of the two parties. Thus, to protect these contracts is to put the great power of the government, its laws, courts, sheriffs, police, on the side of the privileged, and to do it not, as in pre-modern times, as an exercise of brute force against the weak, but as a matter of law. And that's what the police force does to this day. The First Amendment of the Bill of Rights shows the quality of interest hiding behind innocence. Passed in 1791 by Congress, it provided that, quote, Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech or of the press, unquote. Yet 7 years after the First Amendment became part of the Constitution, Congress passed a law very clearly abridging the freedom of speech. This was the Sedition Act of 1798, passed under John Adams' administration, at a time when Irishmen and Frenchmen and the United States were looked out on as dangerous revolutionaries because of the recent French Revolution and the Irish rebellions. The Sedition Act made it a crime to say or write anything, quote, false, scandalous, and malicious against the government, Congress, or the President, with intent to defame them, bring them into dispute, to disrepute, or excite popular hatred against them. This act seemed to directly violate the First Amendment, yet it was enforced. 10 Americans were put in prison for utterances against the government, and every member of the Supreme Court in 1798 to 800, sitting as an appellate judge, held it constitutional. There was a legal basis for this, one known to legal experts, but not to the ordinary American who would read the First Amendment and feel confident that he or she was protected in the exercise of free speech. That basis has been explained by historian Leonard Levy. Levy points out that it was generally understood, not in the population, but in higher circles, that despite the First Amendment, the British common law, quote, seditious libel, still ruled in America. This meant that while the government could not exercise, quote, prior restraint, that is, prevent an utterance of publication in advance, it could legally punish the speaker or writer afterward. Thus, Congress has a convenient legal basis for the laws it has enacted since the time, making it certain kinds of speech of a crime. And since punishment after the fact is an excellent deterrent to the exercise of free expression, the claim of, quote, no prior restraint itself is destroyed. This leaves the First Amendment much less than the stone wall of protection it seems at first glance. After the economic provisions in the Constitution forced justice weekly, we have an intrusive example almost immediately in Washington's first administration, when Congress's power to tax and appropriate money was immediately put to use by the Secretary of State, Secretary of Treasury, Alexander Hamilton, which, by the way, Tom Jefferson's Vice President Aaron Burr ended up killing Alexander Hamilton in the duel later on. Fun fact. Hamilton believed that government must ally itself with the richest elements of society to make itself strong. Proposed to Congress a series of laws which is enacted expressing this philosophy. A Bank of the United States, which now the Fed, was set up as a partnership between the government and certain banking interests. A tariff was passed to help the manufacturers. It was agreed to pay bondholders. Most of the war bonds were now concentrated in a small group of wealthy people. The full value of their bonds, tax laws were passed to raise money for this bond redemption. One of those tax laws was the whiskey tax, which especially hurt false farmers who raised grain that they converted into whiskey and then sold. In 1794, the farmers of western Pennsylvania took up arms and rebelled against the collection of this tax. Secretary of the Treasury Hamilton led the troops to put them down. We see then, in the first years of the Constitution, that some of its provisions, even those paraded most flamboyantly, like the First Amendment, might be treated lightly. Others, like the power to tax, would be powerfully enforced. Still, in the mythology whereon the Founding Fathers persists, to say, as one historian, Bernard Bailyn, has done recently, that, quote, the destruction of privilege and the creation of a political system that demanded of its leaders the responsible and humane use of its power were the highest aspirations, unquote, is to ignore what really happened in the America of the Founding Fathers. Bailyn says, everyone knew the basic prescription for a wise and just government. It was so to balance the contending powers in society that no one power could overwhelm the others and unchecked destroy the liberties that belong to all. The problem was how to arrange the institutions of government so that this balance could be achieved. Were the Founding Fathers wise and just meant trying to achieve a good balance? In fact, they did not want a balance, except once one kept things as they were, a balance among the dominant forces at the time. They certainly did not want an equal balance between slaves and masters, propertyless and property holders, Indians and whites. As many as half the people were not even considered by the Founding Fathers as among Bailyn's, quote, contending powers in society. They were not mentioned in the Declaration of Independence. They were absent in the Constitution. They were invisible to the new political democracy. They were the women of early America. And that is the conclusion for Chapter 5. I hope you guys enjoyed that. I certainly did. I'm hoping later on some of these chapters won't take roughly as long. Let me know down in the comments if you guys are okay with having an hour-long video, or if you guys would like me to try and split the chapters in half and do maybe a 25 to 30 minute video, depending on what you guys like to see. Other than that, always feel free to let me, feel free to drop in the comments anything you might have learned from this book so far, or anything you found interesting, or maybe some recommendations from me for future books, or maybe some criticisms of how I read, or something in particular, so I know how to improve my videos and improve the channel going forward. But other than that, I appreciate you guys watching. It means a lot. I love doing this. It's something that I've been liking to do, and to continue learning while we can. But other than that, have a great day, and see you next time.